Hello, and welcome to the Truman Library Institute's webinar series, The First 5 Days, honoring the 75th anniversary of the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Today, we're joined by Dr. Kurt Graham, Director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, who will be speaking about President Truman's first congressional address. Dr. Graham, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Morgan. Good to be here.
At the conclusion of Dr. Graham's 15-minute presentation, there will be a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. Questions can be submitted during and immediately following his remarks via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Dr. Graham.
Well, thank you, Morgan. Great to be here. And I always love that you announce how long the presentation is going to be so that I know and so that people know what that they're not going to be trapped. But anyway, well, we're going to start. This is kind of an interesting couple of days here in Truman's first week, where we're talking about a couple of really important events over 2 days, the Sunday and Monday of that week. The 12th, of course, was a Thursday when Franklin Roosevelt had died, and he becomes president that evening. And here we are on the Sunday, the 15th, and that's the day that Truman joins Mrs. Roosevelt on the funeral train and rides to Hyde Park, where President Roosevelt is interred. And this is at the family garden. It's a burial site near the Roosevelt home where he'd grown up, near where he had built his library. And because this is an audience interested in presidential libraries, it's probably worth pausing to say that Franklin Roosevelt is the founder of the presidential library system, and he decided to build this small library in Hyde Park that would house his papers and be there for the benefit of the people. As you know, people like Truman and Roosevelt, their papers were personal. They did not belong to the people of the United States. They could have burned them if they'd have wanted to, but they chose to keep their archives open and keep this information available to people. So it's there in this place in Hyde Park, boyhood home, very special place to Franklin Roosevelt. In a minute, we'll run a clip where we'll see some of that funeral procession, and the announcer at one point, I don't know if it's in the clip or not, but the announcer says, they were there to bury a man who had no parallel in his career. And that really sort of hit me to think about that FDR was of such a stature that there really hadn't been anyone, at least in recent memory, who had fulfilled the office the way he had. And so here in Hyde Park with Mrs. Roosevelt and the Roosevelt family and other friends and cabinet members and important people and people who loved and adored Franklin Roosevelt, here stands Harry Truman, paying his respects, doing the best that he can. But it's a very somewhat strange situation, because Harry Truman was not the Harry Truman that you and I know and love today and appreciate him for all the great things he did for the country. Remember, just 82 days prior to this, he still bore the title of senator, and a relatively obscure senator at that. He was respected by his colleagues, but he certainly did not have a national reputation. So he's here, I'm sure, feeling somewhat self-conscious about, in some ways, being a center of attention, but in other ways, of course, they were there for Mrs. Roosevelt and others. And it's very interesting too, I think, that he chose this home, this garden, as a burial site. I'm very interested in presidential psychology, especially when it comes to the selection of a burial site. We're very fortunate at the Truman Library to have Mr. and Mrs. Truman buried and at the site, and you can approach the graves and stand literally at the feet of both of those graves. In Hyde Park, if you've ever been there, it's a beautiful setting, but you can't walk right up to the grave. It's out in almost more like a little bit of a garden or a little bit of a pasture or lawn that surrounds it a little bit. So it's interesting to think about presidents having to choose a site where people are going to come to visit, when they know people are going to come to visit. Most of us don't have that thought. We're buried in a family plot in our hometown or something, and you don't really think about large numbers of people coming to visit. So anyway, just part of what had gone into his process there, and here is Harry Truman with Eleanor Roosevelt, and I think we're going to roll a clip now of that funeral coverage.
And all along the 700-mile route, people gather to honor President Roosevelt and his ideals. train backs into Union Station in the United States Capitol, awaited by a military guard of honor and members of the late great Chief Executive's family. With Justice Burns and Secretary Wallace, President Harry S. Truman heads the assemblage of the nation's leaders. Now, home again, to the garden of his family home in Hyde Park, New York, comes President Roosevelt. Here in the old and lovely Hudson River estate, which several years ago he bequeathed to the people of the United States, the mortal remains of a man whose career has known no parallel in our time will rest forever. Mrs. Roosevelt and her family.
That's fairly sobering footage, I think, to think about what must have been going through his mind. And you know, interestingly, as soon as that was over, he immediately boarded the train to head back to Washington. And his daughter Margaret later said that's when the real politicking began. He had hoped to work on his speech that he was going to give to the Congress the next day, and he ended up, you know, having so many interruptions, people wanting to come and have a few minutes with the president and get their 2 cents in as to what he should be doing. So he didn't get the chance to work on his speech as much as he would have liked to on that trip, and that was important to him because Truman, I have to preface this by saying he was not really a natural public speaker. He was not a gifted public speaker at all, especially compared to someone like Franklin Roosevelt, who had such a charisma and such an ease with which he could speak. Truman never really achieved that. I mean, he did get better at it as he went through his presidency. I think he got more relaxed, but he never became, you know, what we think of John F. Kennedy or even Lyndon Johnson or certainly Ronald Reagan, some of these great orators who have been in our recent time in the White House. But I was visiting again with, when I was talking the other day to my friend at the FDR Library, the director there, over the course of this anniversary, as we have talked about FDR and Truman together and done these various programs at our respective institutions, he has learned a little bit about Harry Truman, I think, and he made an interesting comment to me. He said, I've come to respect and appreciate Harry Truman a lot more than I ever have. And what he realized, I think he read some of the speeches, he read some of the things that Truman had written, and Truman is much easier and more impactful to read than he is to listen to. When you listen to a speech by Harry Truman, it's not nearly as compelling as when you just read his words. I mean, he actually is a very powerful thinker, and I think he comes up with some great ideas, and he expresses himself very well. It's just that he did not have the studied, steady acting credentials that some of our other presidents have had, and it did not always come off as clearly. But anyway, if we flip to that next slide, you'll see a picture of the new president entering the, he's in giving his speech there, and as he came in to the chamber, he's in the House of Representatives, the chamber of the House, and he comes in there, and of course it's just thunderous ovation and applause, and everybody stands and they greet him, and there's such a warm welcome. And so Truman, maybe a little nervous, I don't know what, he goes up to the stand there, he just immediately launches into a speech, and the Speaker of the House interrupts him, Sam Rayburn, a good friend of his, interrupted him so that he could introduce him to the House. And so, of course, everybody laughed and roared about that and gave him another thunderous ovation once he had been introduced. And then Truman launches into to his speech. And I want to share just a little bit of this language. I know I'll be conscious of time here, but he immediately begins almost, it's almost like he's reliving the funeral. I mean, he talks a little bit about, it is with heavy heart that I stand before you, my friends and colleagues in the Congress of the United States. Important to remember that these were friends and colleagues. Just shortly before that, he had been a United States Senator for a decade, and he had many very close friends. He was just one of the boys, as he would have said, one among many. And now suddenly he had been vaulted to this new station. And he starts by praising Roosevelt for all he has done for the country. And tragic fate has thrust upon us grave responsibilities. We must carry on. Our departed leader never looked backward. He looked forward and moved forward. That is what he would want us to do. That is what America will do. So I think he was eager to build on that, and he credits Roosevelt with everything, with the war effort, with the economic turnaround, all those things. In fact, I thought this line really jumped out at me and gives you a little pang for the United States' role in the world. He said, "Today, the entire world is looking to America for enlightened leadership, to peace and progress. Such a leadership requires vision, courage, and tolerance. It can be provided only by a united nation deeply devoted to the highest ideals." Again, that strikes us today, I think, as something aspirational, to be that united nation that the world would turn to see us living out our highest ideals. Interesting for me, just a couple things about this speech. I mean, this was his first opportunity to address not just the Congress, but the nation. I mean, he's a relatively unknown figure at this point. And so this is a very consequential moment for Harry Truman. And of course, the war is not over. I mean, Germany has not surrendered. Japan has not surrendered. We've got a war on two fronts going on. Now it's clearly winding up, but how that's going to wind up is yet to be determined. So Truman starts by sort of putting Germany and Japan both on notice that nothing is going to change, that we will fight for freedom until no vestige of resistance remains. And I think, you know, he says something very, very important in this speech that comes into play later in August. As you know, we're celebrating the 75th of the end of the war as well later this summer. And the dropping of the bombs in August will bring the war to an end. But he sort of lays down the gauntlet here on his, you know, third or fourth day in office when he says, we will not settle for a partial victory. To settle for merely another temporary respite would surely jeopardize the future security of all the world. Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender. We will not traffic with the breakers of the peace on the terms of the peace. So unconditional surrender, that gets discussed, as you know, later in August, and Truman can't really back out of that now. I mean, he said this publicly, he said this to the country, he said it to the world, and there's no way to get around the fact that that he has to insist that Japan completely surrender. And one of the things that I find really interesting about this speech, right off the bat, that sort of foreshadows so much of what Truman is about, and that is that his approach to international issues, like the end of the war and many, many other issues that he will confront during his presidency, is all rooted in his understanding of what America is and what America should be and how America should conduct itself. So this whole notion of what it means to have this country and to be concerned about the welfare of the American citizens and not just the citizens of the world. And he ties those things together, I think, so nicely. He says, "Let me assure the forward-looking people of America that there will be no relaxation in our efforts to improve the lot of the common people." And that wasn't just a sort of social welfare stance. that had everything to do with how he saw America's role in the world. We need to take care of our people, and then those people, all of us together, can help take care of the world. It's really, I think, a theme that you see over and over again with Truman. So he ends this speech with a little bit more of a, and if people didn't know him at that time, this would have been a very interesting thing. It's a very religious feeling that he brings. He talks about hope. In the dark hours of war, entire nations were kept going by something intangible, and that something was hope. He said, hope has become the secret weapon of the forces of liberation. Pretty powerful thought, I think, to think that the hope of the people in the war was really what propelled them forward. You know, we've learned how to fight with other nations. Now he says we need to learn how to live with other nations for our mutual good. We must trade more with other nations for our mutual advantage. It really has this sense of how we need to treat other nations in the world. And that's based on his understanding of what he thinks American goodness and the American ideal really is. But he ends on a very personal note. He says, at this moment, I have in my heart a prayer. As I have assumed my heavy duties, I humbly pray Almighty God in the words of King Solomon. Then he quotes from the Bible, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this, thy so great a people? I only ask that I only ask to be a good and faithful servant of the Lord and of my people. That's a pretty, you know, laying it out there in terms of his belief, and he was, as you know, you remember, you know, Truman often chopped the air with his hands. He was a very dynamic, very animated speaker, even if not always the most charismatic. I mean, he really put a lot into what he had to say. And so I think, you know, as I said before, this was a big moment for him in his presidency. If we advance one more slide, I think there's a final shot of him in the chamber, you know, with a standing ovation with everybody around him. And this really meant a lot to Truman. You know, again, he's so intimidated. He's got to fill Franklin Roosevelt's shoes here. He's got to end this war. He's got to keep the world together. He's got to keep the economy going, look out for ordinary people. I think this was a very triumphal moment for him. If this was the way he was going to begin his presidency, his initial address to the nation, if you judge by the response he received and by the quality of the text that he delivered, I think you'd have to say it was a stunning success. I think he felt his presidency was off to a good start based on the way people received him. And I'm sure that meant a great deal to him. I'm sure it was very much a concern that people would not necessarily warm to him in the way they had to Roosevelt. On the next slide, we have a illustration, I guess you would say, of what I was just trying to describe. I think this is an interesting, very sort of powerful sketch of the great presidents of the past. You see Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, and FDR, all sort of looking over his shoulder. And it suggests, of course, that the mantle of authority, the mantle of the presidency, has fallen upon Truman, and he is now the voice. He is now the spokesman for this nation, and with the support of all of these other great folks who have gone before. That's, I think, something in a previous era that even despite partisan divides, I think people were more inclined to think this way, that the morning after an election, people could say, well, you know, this guy's my president too, even if I didn't vote for him. I think we're less inclined to that as a public and as voters. I think we're less inclined to that attitude today. Flipping forward one more slide, as he reflected on the day, he wrote a note to his sister and mother, and he said, you know, I got to address the Congress, and it seemed to go well, judging from the ovation that I received. Things have gone so well that I'm almost as scared as I was when Mrs. Roosevelt told me what had happened. And I think that you know, he's got that fear still. I love this picture, and this is the final shot here, but this is his sister, Mary Jane, reading from the paper, you know, about his address, about, you know, his first days in office, and Mama Truman there and his brother, Vivian. And what I love about this is it's just so ordinary. These are just regular people. This is a very humble family, humble little group. And just years before, just a little more than a decade before this, their brother and her son was a county executive. He was a county judge, and, you know, was maybe in the newspaper once in a while. He was building roads in Jackson County and doing things like that. But within just a little over a decade, he went from being a county executive to being the commander-in-chief. And so for these three people who, you know, come from the sort of Grandview farm part of his life, and his sister, of course, had to farm down there when he went off to World War I, which she did not particularly appreciate, being abandoned in that way. It was a hardscrabble kind of life for them, for the Trumans. And I think to see their son and their brother vaulted to this lofty position, the leader of the free world, was just unfathomable. I don't know how any family would be able to process that. I think it's just interesting to think about what must be going through their minds and how they must process what's going on there. So anyway, if we advance, I think we're to the point to, are we? Yes, we are.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Dr. Graham, for a wonderful presentation. If you have a question and haven't added it to the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, please go ahead and do so now. You can also like a question that's already been submitted that you would like to see answered. And our first question comes to us from George, who says, did Truman write his own speeches?
Yeah, I mean, he definitely, I mean, there were people around, obviously, that were, you know, that could, you know, he could bounce ideas off of, but the idea of a speech writing machine like we have today, you know, that two or three people sit down and write the speech, and the president, you know, kind of just puts a little finishing touch on it. That's a more modern development. People, you know, and that doesn't mean they didn't have help or they didn't have drafts, you know, and things were circulating and things and whatnot. But no, Truman very much was a man of his own words.
All right, our next question comes from Brian. And what were world leaders saying about Truman's emergence to the presidency?
Well, he started to get some cables and you know, telegrams and things from world leaders, you know, sort of wishing him well and you know, eager to work with him and that kind of thing. You know, the most famous one, I suppose, is Churchill, who you know, admits to Truman that after he, you know, works him a little bit, that, you know, I said I was scared to death, or I can't remember the exact phrase, I'm going to butcher it, but basically I didn't have much hope going into this that you were going to be much of anything. And he really surprised Churchill. I mean, Churchill became a fond and fast friend, and I think others were similar. I think they were cautious. I think they, you know, he was a respectable guy, and I think whatever else, I don't think, you know, there wasn't anything sort of untoward. But at the same time, I think, you know, compared to Franklin Roosevelt, I think people were you know, tomorrow's presentation about can he swing the job, I think you'll get a better answer to that from Clifton, because, you know, that's really what he's going to talk about, is what were people saying about Truman? What did they think of him? My basic short answer to that is people who already knew him, people who had worked with him either in the Senate or in some other capacity, they knew darn good and well that he could swing the job and that he was up to it. People who didn't know him and only knew him through the papers and really didn't know much about him, I think were, you know, he hadn't gone to Harvard. He wasn't from a sort of a blue blood aristocratic family. I mean, he was a different kind of a cat. And I think they were kind of took a wait and see kind of look.
All right, our next question comes from Les. And it says, Truman had come from the Senate and was good friends with Speaker Rayburn. What caused his relationship with Congress to degrade over his presidential tenure?
Well, you know, these tricky little things called elections come along, and the power dynamic and the party in control can change, as it does and as it did. And then also, you know, that's one reason is the changing makeup of those bodies, but also, especially in Truman's second term, as he got into, you know, things like Korea and just the response to that, he just became increasingly unpopular with the public, and of course with the leaders of the Congress as well. The Republican-led Congress by then, as you know, when he fired MacArthur, invited MacArthur to give that famous speech, you know, old soldiers never die, they just fade away, and everybody's, you know, wiping tears away, and how great MacArthur is and whatnot. And Truman really sort of had to kind of swallow hard and just kind of take it, because it was, you know, it was kind of MacArthur's moment, and the Republicans granted him that moment. Now history has seen that in a different light, but at the time, at Truman's time, he really did have a rough go with some of those folks in the Congress and over things like that, the firing of MacArthur, Korea, and such issues.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. It might be trickier to answer. It's from David, and it says, on April 16th, 1945, at the top of the schedule shown in your presentation was Hugh Fulton. And who was he? Why was he at the top of the visitation schedule for the day?
Yeah, I'll just have to punt on that and say I really don't know. I don't know what the significance of that is, but I will tell you that Truman, as you look at his schedules, especially as he goes on, he called them the customers. He said the customers start calling in, and he had these 10 and 20-minute increments throughout the day where he had just one person in after another. I mean, he saw a lot of people, met with a lot of people, and the what do I want to say? The bar was not as high as it would be today. I mean, to get an appointment, a personal appointment with the president today would be a much more difficult thing to pull off than it was in Truman's time. That doesn't mean that, I mean, I'm sure this guy, and I'm sorry if any of you are related to him or something, I'm sure he's a very important person and I should know who he is, but the point is, it would not have been as difficult to get in front of the president or get on his schedule if you had a legitimate concern or reason to want to do that.
We actually, the audiovisual specialist from the Truman Library, Lori, has chimed in the chat. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Lori.
So she says that Hugh Fulton is the chief counsel of the Special Committee of the Senate to investigate the National Defense Program, or the Truman Committee, and he served in that role from 1941 to 1944.
Yeah, so he would have known him well. Yeah, okay, sure.
Excellent.
Thank
All
you.
right, well, I think that is all the time we have for questions today. We've had a lot of great questions over the course of this series. If your question didn't get answered, I have great news. On Friday, Mark Adams with the Truman Library and Clifton Truman Daniel will be joining us to answer some of these questions that we haven't had time to get to over the course of the webinars. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and special thanks to Dr. Graham for this excellent and informative presentation. As a reminder, this presentation was the third installment of our 5-part webinar series, and registration links to the 2 remaining programs, including tomorrow's program hosted by Clifton Truman Daniel, can be found on our website, trumanlibraryinstitute.org. In addition to these special webinars, we're commemorating the 75th anniversary of Truman's presidency over the coming weeks on all of our social channels. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more stories about Harry Truman's early days as our 33rd president. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and we'll hope to see you tomorrow.